I'm Tim Ventura, and we're joined today by Amal Graafstra, book author, TEDx speaker, and CEO of the biohacking companies Dangerous Things and VivoKey Technologies. Amal has various RFID and NFC implants in his body that open doors, start vehicles, unlocks his smart gun, and logs into computers. Prior to his current roles, Amal's experience includes numerous executive and IT-related roles at firms including Walletmor, Everfind, the medical biotech company Morpheus, Atomic Mobile, Silicon Energy, and more. He joins us today to discuss the intersection of biology and technology and the evolution of our relationship with machines. So, Amal, welcome back, sir. Today,
Well,
we're
thank you.
talking about Neuralink. And when I started thinking about that, I was like, what is the best way to kind of showcase this to people who might not be familiar with it? So, essentially, in many ways, we're talking about the merger of man and machine. And I wanted to go through some of the evolutionary buildup to this because I think that people will be surprised to realize that this is really already underway. It's already happening. Neuralink is part of a process, I think, that has been going on for quite a while. So I wanted to start with something that everybody knows about, which is the Apple Watch. This features an electrocardiogram, blood oxygen sensor, sleep tracking, menstrual cycle analysis, fall detection, contactless payment abilities, and family location tracking. Now, over the last decade, we've seen the smartphone evolve into a Swiss Army knife for communications tools, but I think it is less obvious that the watch is evolving into kind of a form of biomedical augmentation for the body. Would that be a good way to describe it?
Yeah, I think so. When you're talking about the watch versus phone, like there's the clear problem with the phone is it can't do that in your pocket, right? It's not on your body. It's not actually within proximity to be able to be utilized in that way. I think starting with the Apple Watch is an interesting starting point, but I think it's important to point out that let's go way back. Let's talk about like the actual first tool users, right? Like human species, we're not the only tool users on the planet. There are plenty of others. Corvids are famous for being able to use tools to get access to food and things, but corvids like crows, things like that. There's other ape-based, species that also use tools. But I think what makes us interesting and unique is that we quickly evolved into a species that not just wanted to use tools to achieve an end goal and be happy with that. We also seek to improve ourselves, right?
Yeah.
And tools do that. Tools give us the abilities that we natively or inherently don't have. And there is something altogether fascinating with where we've taken that drive, right? We've brought this to the point where we want to not just improve ourselves, but we want to know about ourselves. We want to quantify ourselves, and the whole quantified self movement is part of that interesting thing. So, you wear a watch, you have a Fitbit, you wear an Apple Watch, you get all this data, not just because at the end of the day you're only concerned with, I want to have a better, medical outcome, right? You're curious. You want to know these things that are unquantified as of yet about yourself. And so bringing technology closer and closer to the body to the point where eventually we're talking about bringing it in the body, not just for a medically restorative purpose, right, like a pacemaker, right, you're improving, restoring a function, but for additional, almost you might call them enhance or augmentative purposes. Even just being able to quantify things that aren't necessarily critical for your medical outcome, but still interesting to be able to have this personal information feedback, to be able to improve your visibility on things you didn't have before. So it's a form of improving yourself, even just being able to be aware of things about your body that you're not normally aware of. I think it's super fascinating. And so when we talk about technology, getting closer to the body or becoming part of us in a way, we are kind of already, cyborgs in a way, in the way that a tool user is going to integrate these tools into their lives in such a deep capacity that it fundamentally changes the way that you live your life. It fundamentally changes the way you interact with the universe around you and how you perceive that universe even. So we are like cyborgs already, and that argument's been made for decades now. But But yeah, it is an interesting insertion point for this discussion is the Apple Watch. Yeah.
It is, and actually, the reason that I tend to key in on this was, what so, I'm familiar with Fitbit, that's one, Samsung Watch is kind of a competitor to Apple Watch. There are a ton of what they call wearables that are out there that do various functions. So the Apple Watch, I think, is maybe a little bit more cohesive and definitely, more, I guess, widely known than the others. But the thing that got me interested in that was there are two aspects of it. The first one is I have elderly parents, right?
Mhm.
And so it has a lot of features like the fall detection and the heart rate monitoring and some of these biological monitoring features are useful. And I've read about people buying these for elderly parents because they're
Mhm.
worried, right?
Yeah.
They're concerned. And then the other aspect of it is the location tracking and the fact that it's attached to the wrist, which is useful for people with children. And I have a child, and that was something I looked at several years ago as well. So the Apple Watch is one of those things where I thought that was a great starting point because, as you'd mentioned, as tool users, in the past, it has been pick something up when you need it, put it down when you don't. This is one where we're starting to augment our bodies, but it's attached to the body. And it also has features like, for instance, I looked this up. You can use this to automatically open your Tesla, and I believe you can do contactless payments with it. But something that you've talked about in the past is once you get into things like that, if your watch gets stolen, you run into problems. So the next step after that is implants, right?
Yeah. And the major difference, I think, between an implant and a wearable isn't necessarily the theft aspect or loss aspect, but that is a big component. You can't lose a thing that you can't lose, right? But the major difference between an Apple Watch and an implant that could do similar or the same is that the watch is still a management burden, right? It's still something you have to put on, take off, charge, manage, right? That management burden is a major factor, and it's one of the major factors as to why like half of the Fitbits that were purchased end up in the drawer because
Yeah.
the management burden is not worth it. And we already have a pretty significant management burden. We have our keys, wallet, and phone. Those are the three like modern day Tamagotchi that we need to attend to, manage, put our energy into, make sure that they're okay, they're charged up, they got the signal, right? All this effort goes into managing these things that are requirements for living our daily lives, but they're not typically things that we really care about. Meaning, like having to carry your wallet is a burden only. There's no like advantage to having to lug this stuff around. Carrying your keys isn't fun. There's nothing interesting about that. It's just something you have to do because you have to be able to get into things. And these kinds of things are one of the major reasons why I got into implants in the first place. Is I just wanted to get rid of these management burdens. But when you start talking about advanced technology, things that do more than just act as an identity token to your car or a payment terminal or whatever. Now there's something that these devices can actually do for you actively, and so the Apple Watch is an example of that. So it's a that is a management burden people are willing to take on, and the fact that there is this expectation of semi-permanence. It's going to be on your body from morning to night. It's not terribly difficult to maintain throughout the day. There is management when you take it off. You have to make sure it's charged, and you have to do that process. But overall, a watch is great because it's you strap it on, and then it's like your clothes that you put on. You you don't really think about it; just there doing its job, and that's a great aspect of implants. Is once they're there, they're just doing their job. And right now, we only have, excuse me, right now we only have passive implants, meaning that they don't have a power supply. They're only active when you bring them within the field of the reader, which is a very small magnetic bubble around the reader. So in that way, they're great for zero management. I don't have to charge them or think about them ever. I just present them and they're used, and then they go, they go inert when I pull my hand away. So in the future, though, when we start talking about things like Neuralink or Apple Watch or monitors that are active, they have batteries and power sources, we're going to add some amount of burden, right? But locating that device, losing it, putting it on in the morning, taking it off, like hitting it on things and breaking it, those things go away. Those management aspects go away, and you're down to simply ensuring that it has charge. And there might be wireless energy transfer systems coming online soon that will get rid of that part of it. And so, in the future, if you can improve the safety of battery and energy storage technology to the point where you can have an implant that's consumer grade, that doesn't have to be a $30,000 pacemaker implant because the battery could explode in your chest. So you have to put all this QA into it. If we have advances in material science that allow us to have a $300 implant that isn't going to explode inside of us, right? That opens the door to a lot of interesting and intriguing applications that you can move. That tool can now be moved away from this wearable platform into an implantable platform, and then it becomes simply a procedure at your regular GP's inpatient procedure, right? They just do it right there in the office, and now you've got this insane capability that you don't really have to think about. I love to say, like, my implants are very much like my kidneys. They go in there and they do their job, and I don't give them a second thought, right? They just that's the beauty of it, right? It's the zero management. That's so magical, and it's like very freeing. So as a species improve our tools, the usability and management and effectiveness that they can provide for us is often at odds with how difficult they are to manage and maintain. And if you can drop that maintaining, management burden to next to zero, yeah, I mean, that's the goal, right? To be able to improve ourselves in a way that isn't a burden, right? That's
Yeah.
the goal.
Well, and I want to urge people to look at your company's VivoKey Technologies and Dangerous Things. And I'm going to put links in the show notes for both of those, right? So, VivoKey and Dangerous Things, just to learn what you're doing and where the technology is at right now. I think this is absolutely remarkable, and now it's not for everyone. One of the things that I've seen is that there's definitely some psychological barriers to implants, and I think that
Mm.
those may be eroding. But from what I've read online, a lot of people shy away from the idea of an implant for something like identification, contactless payments, security access, or even health monitoring. But interestingly, if their doctor tells them that they need something like replacement knee, pacemaker, cochlear implant for hearing, intraocular lens for cataract surgery, or even a birth control implant, typically they don't question that. So I would
Yeah.
tend to view that as a psychological barrier, right? Where the doctor says, well, there's medical necessity here, and they sign the form typically without giving it a ton of thought. Whereas if it's for something that may make their life a lot more convenient or secure or open up new capabilities, there's this barrier to adding things to the body, right?
Yeah, so actually, I find it interesting the applications you listed. Let me just start by saying that generally speaking, people don't have a problem with the idea of getting an implant. The reaction is, "Ooh, there's an ick factor," right?
Yeah.
But that ick factor is imaginary because people will do horrific things to their body for applications that some might see compelling and others not. Breast augmentation is a huge, tearing up of flesh and tissue and stuff, but the application for that patient is compelling. They will do that without a second thought, or they might give it some thought, but they still do it, right, by the millions. Out of all the applications you listed, pacemaker and all that, only the last one, the birth control, is not a restorative medically necessary procedure. So it's one thing to say you're having a problem and you need to restore function in some way. That's one thing. I consider those to be different. The medical necessity of a birth control implant is, that's to be argued by other people, but it is for sure an augmentation. It is
Yeah.
not restorative, right? It is, I'm making a decision that I want my body to perform this way, and I'm going to implant this device to make sure it does that. And why an implant versus taking a pill? Well, maintenance burden, right? You have to remember to take the pill. You have to do those things. You could totally do that, take a pill, but a lot of people choose like, hey, if I could just get this little procedure done, it's like a body piercing, but not even that. And then I'm good for 3 months, 6 months, or whatever. That's great. That's reducing my management burden of this thing that I want my body to be doing. And so, in very much the same way, there's not really a barrier. There's not a psychological barrier. It's just, is there a compelling application? right? Because the actual procedure of getting one of our devices implanted is the same as getting Norplant or a birth control implant. It's the same. In fact, it's better because the birth control implant has to come out in a matter of months and be replaced, whereas ours, you're good for life, right? And it's the same exact thing. You put a needle under the skin, you eject the thing, and the needle goes away, and you're done, right? And so, yeah, that idea that there's a psychological barrier is just you haven't found a compelling application yet to just convince you to go and do that thing. But yeah, when it comes down to the logical actual act of doing the implant, it's safer on your body than getting an ear piercing.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and again, going back to Neuralink as kind of our end goal with this.
Hmm.
So that's a mind implant. What you're talking about are body implants. And
Yeah,
I've
yeah,
read, in my reading, there's what they call invasive, which I believe has electrodes that go into the gray matter of the brain. There's semi-invasive, where it goes under the skull, but nothing actually penetrates the brain. And then there's non-invasive, which uses like basically EKG or something of the equivalent to kind of monitor brain waves. And if I understand correctly, Neuralink is actually invasive or at least semi-invasive. They have a robot for surgery that they're using there. So that takes this idea further, right? You're not just putting something into your body, you're putting it into your mind. But the end goal is being able to control computers. And on the Neuralink website, this isn't necessarily a passive thing, right? Where instead of like moving your hand near a security thing to unlock a door, Neuralink is actually letting you move a mouse on a screen. It's letting you interact with a computer. So it seems like that is kind of the next step beyond simple implants. Would that be a fair statement?
well, there is a fundamental difference between even a pacemaker and what we're doing. So what we're doing is we're simply upgrading the body's capabilities by just moving a thing from your pants pocket to a skin pocket, right? There's no actual interaction with the body. It's just we're relying on the body to see that implant the device and then lock it down with fibrin and collagen and just keep it snug and secure right there.
Yeah.
That's the only extent we're expecting from the body, and that works great. But there's no actual interaction with our body. There's no actual interaction with our neurons. Now, a pacemaker is different. A pacemaker is designed to actually affect the function of the body by interacting with the heart muscle and the neurons firing there. So that's fundamentally more interesting, I think, in terms of technology and biological interaction. Neuralink takes that way further. Obviously, it's still the same concept. You're going to interact with neurons, but you're going to do so at a much higher resolution. So you have these three, kind of things that you mentioned. There's Neuralink, which is invasive, and it does go, multi-probe lengths go into the brain, and the robot is used to avoid blood vessels, so there's no
Yeah.
bleeding and stuff like that. Then there's, under dura, which is like the skull, and then there's a dura that protects the brain, and there's some that go on the outside of the dura, some that are just on the inside that do actually make a little bit of contact with the brain, and then there's totally external. But at each level, you're getting less and less resolution, right? You're not talking to neurons. Neuralink is talking to individual neurons. The kind of neural lace, or whatever you want to call it, the thing that's kind of just under skull, is more of a concept than a product. It's an imagined concept, but I haven't
Yeah.
seen anything functional. But it's more of a generic, better resolution than a sensors on the scalp, but still not very. You're not talking to individual neurons. You're just getting a general picture of some activity, and then you're external. But none of those. Well, I will say this: there is a way for you to actually talk to neurons rather than just listen to them from external, but it's not very accurate. It's a transcranial magnetic stimulation, where you focus a magnetic field at a point inside of 3D space in your head, and it will induce an electric current that will shock a neuron into action. But that's not very practical, and it's not very accurate, and it's good for big mass shocks for like epilepsy or stuff like that. Neuralink is the for well, there's another company that's working on an neural interaction that goes through the blood vessel, and it
Mm.
goes and deploys a stent in the blood vessel so that the sensors and the interaction array deploys inside there, so you're not going through the skull, you're kind of the backdoor method, but considered to be less invasive because you don't need to cut open skull. But these two companies, what they're doing is not just trying to control a computer. That's more or less monitoring. So one way to communication, neurons out, right? Sensing. Neuralink and Synchron, which is this other company, they are actively trying to communicate in a bidirectional way with neurons, which is fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Um, the what you the thing that Neuralink is trying to put out there right now is like, hey, we can try to solve locked-in syndrome or brain injury problems, and we
Yeah.
can form some communication. That's great. That's a great first step, but that is not the breadth of the possibilities here. If you can actually, I mean, if you're ready to go off the rails, we can go, right. We can be speculative and we can talk about where this is probably going to lead, or in one way or another. But today we're talking about restorative functions of these technologies. How can we help people that have injuries or other conditions to live a better life? But my interest is purely in the augmentative uh, aspects of this, because if I can communicate with neurons directly, I mean, Elon Musk has stated the goal is to open up the bandwidth between the human mind and computers. Because right now, it's talking to Alexa, it's typing on a keyboard, it's clicking in a mouse, and taking in the visual response, or if you're blind, taking in other responses from the computer and trying to communicate that way. So that bandwidth is very low, right? With the computer, I'm typing in individual words, or I'm manipulating a mouse or something like that, and that's pretty terrible. Particularly, in his view, and I think in a lot of people's view in the space, is that when you start having these AI start to come online, in terms of right now when you talk to Chat GTP, it's responsive. It's not coming up with thoughts on its own, right? It's not doing things on its own, but it
Yeah.
is a reactionary relay, right? There's nothing to say that you couldn't feed in sensor data into this kind of thing. It would interpret it in real time and then take action. So just like our brains, if we need input and we're reacting to it all the time, rarely do we come up with our own thoughts, right? We're almost an ongoing feedback reactionary system, rather than like an inspired out of nowhere kind of thought producer. So sometimes that happens for the human mind, but in general, we're reacting to our own thoughts, and it's just a kind of an ongoing reactionary chain from birth to death. And that's our behavior, right? So you can do that with AI. You can start feeding it in things, and it will react to those things in very much the same way. And it might look like decision making, right? It might even look like creativity, depending on what filters generally take that output and then actually do something with it. But there will be a time where there will be systems like this, whether they're conscious or sentient or not is irrelevant. There's already abilities for these computer systems and AIs to do this kind of feedback reactionary looping and generate output on their own, it looks like, anyway. And so that could be leveraged for work, that could be leveraged for other decision making. And I see that happening. I don't see that not happening, right? There's going to be these things. And so the concern, I guess, that Musk and others have is that, will humans be able to keep up with this, right?
Yeah.
And no, because it's the speed at which that these AI systems, even if you consider different AI systems working together, right, to solve problems or whatever. You've got this system over here that's good at this kind of thing, and this system over here that's got this, and they can work together. The speed at which those systems can work together is well beyond what you and I can, because I can't communicate thoughts and ideas to you. I have to translate them into words and spit them out of my mouth hole, and then you got to take them in, right? It's very slow. So even if we don't consider that, if we just consider human to human bandwidth through computers, like we're doing now, right? Um, if you have a neural interface that's capable at a much greater resolution, we're not talking about like 30 fibers, we're talking about like pretty much all brain augmentation, um, where you start to use this neural interface more and more, and your brain starts reorganizing itself to use these pipelines more and more, then you will end up with what I think is kind of an entirely new approach for communication, and it will feel like the difference between, if we were using that to communicate, and I was just like convinced, like relaying images in my head and thoughts and feelings without actually verbalizing them, words kind of lose their meaning because I'm
Mm.
not using them anymore. I don't need labels to describe the thing because I can communicate exactly what I'm thinking. And that thought process no longer requires those symbols, right? You can interpret those things in the way that you can interpret feeling. Like, how do you describe blue, right? Like, that's the problem, is how do you break that down? But if I can communicate blue to you in my mind of what blue is, right? Like the color
Yeah.
itself, that's a fundamentally different level of communication. And so I could see us getting to the point where that's going to be a mode of communication with people, that if you had to communicate with somebody without this thing, it would feel like, we're having a Zoom call, but now I got to talk to this person. Oh, I'm writing a letter on the paper with a pen, right? That's how slow and tedious it would feel to have to communicate with somebody, just verbally, right? And so I think that there's good and bad in that, right? There's definitely, that's a nightmare scenario for a lot of people. But I see that becoming a thing in the 50, 100-year future from now, maybe. But then when you start talking about, and I can ramble forever, so you can interrupt me if you want to, but I definitely see a future where we also interact with AIs. We also interact with our computer systems, our private personal computer systems, in that way, where the computer systems will anticipate our needs rather than we have to think, control the thing, or turn on the lights. It's just going to know our intention, because we're going to, you're getting up in the morning. Okay. And it's like, okay, we'll get the coffee going, stuff. And, but then you think, oh, I don't want to, I'm going to avoid, you're just thinking to yourself, like, no coffee this morning. Boo, the coffee shuts down. And
Well,
like, you know,
so even actually, you were mentioning interacting with the computers. There are so many different avenues, and actually, what you were talking about with the abstraction of ideas is brilliant. That in itself, I think, is worth highlighting for people. But, um, y so one of the things that has come to my mind is, like, the new Apple glasses, right? And I know that Oculus has had VR glasses, and there are other brands that are working on those. In some cases, people use them for like immersive VR gaming, things like that. With the Apple one, what caught me was apparently there's a mode where you can have your primary computer monitor in front of you, and you can just throw up virtual computer monitors on the side, right? And you
mhm,
can also throw up indicators and things that are kind of in your visual field that don't really exist. It's just in the
right.
glasses. And so using an implant, you could do something similar where you could augment your ability to work. That's really basic and it's visually oriented. Going more towards what you were talking about, this idea of being able to instantly access knowledge, right? Which would be kind of an augmented memory capability. And that's what the internet and Chat GPT do already. It's just
Right.
making it seamless. So instead of
Yeah.
having to ask Chat GPT, you just think about it and the answer comes to you. And that's again, that's pretty basic. That's not even playing with what you're talking about, which is being able to more fully communicate concepts instead of having to put them into the label of like the word blue, for instance.
Yeah, yeah. So it gets even crazier than that, because when we are seeing aspects of what I'm about to talk about now. Like, people are putting on VR goggles and living in VR for extended periods of time. They'll go to sleep with them on, they'll wake up, and it's more of an experiment at this point, but brain plasticity being what it is they start to really feel that environment. And just like if you do the phantom limb thing, where, I don't know if you've seen this, but they put a blocking thing, and they have your hands on the table, they block your vision, and then they give you a fake hand that represents your hand, right? And
Okay.
then they stimulate both hands with like a feather, the fake hand and your other real hand, and very quickly your brain will start to feel that feather on your left hand, let's say. Um, and what it's doing is the brain is visually saying, well, that's my hand, and I can see that it's, you fooled your brain into thinking that's my real hand. It's not, it's fake. Your real hand's over here and can't be seen, but your brain's visual input is saying that's my hand. And so you can fool your brain into feeling that input, that feather, even though it's on the fake hand. And then inevitably, the joke is they smash it with a hammer, and you go, oh, you freak out because your brain is convinced within 5 minutes that that is your real hand, but it's not. And they do it with ice and different things, and your brain gets more and more involved in saying that, invested in That's my hand. I should be feeling cold. I should be feeling, so you feel it, right? It generates that feeling and you feel it. And the same thing is happening in VR now, where people are in experiencing these environments long enough that the perceptions that we have when we are near another person, that sense of personal space in the VR world, there are people whose brains are convinced they're being touched by someone else in VR.
Hmm.
So if the two VR, somebody comes up to you in the VR and touches your avatar, right? They feel it. They do feel a sensation. It's not the same as being hit, obviously, but that tingling sensation that something's touching me, they're experiencing that. So their brain has plasticized itself and convinced itself that this is a real environment. This is really me. I'm represented in real time by your proprioception. Like, so they have sensors on their hands, and it's not just the glasses. They have the VR and the sensors, so that when they move their hands around, it's exactly represented in VR, to the point where the brain's proprioception of, like, my hands are in space and I know where they are. If you close your eyes, you can tell where your hands are, because that's represented visually in VR. They get that sense that this is really my body now, and the brain is fooled. And when people come and violate that space, they feel it in some capacity. So, but what I think is wild, and what I think is very interesting, is when we start talking about putting actual neural communication into the brain, and the mind is a product of the brain. The mind is what arises. It's a function that the brain is
Yeah.
providing, but the brain is the mechanics that is providing that. When you provide the brain, which is plastic, it's constantly changing to accommodate our new configurations and things, and neurons reach out and synapses get stronger and whatever. But you introduce this new alternative communication method for neurons with something, right? What I think is going to happen is that plasticity will break the idea that it's me and my mind controlling a thing or communicating with a thing. What I think will be possible with a high resolution, even with a small resolution, but particularly with a high resolution, lot of neural interfaces in there, you will be able to start to move thought processes, neural processes out of the biology and into the digital neural realm.
Yeah.
Meaning, like, it's not just about, like, I need to communicate some information or ask Google. Part of the actual process of thought will naturally start to migrate through plasticity. The neurons in your brain, the squishy bits, are going to align themselves to outsource some of this communication and actually thought, like, outside the thing. So given the correct kind of inputs, you could imagine a future where I'm renting brain space from Amazon, right? Like an elastic brain, instance where I'm like, oh, I'm gonna think about some hard stuff today, and you pay, $20 a month for, a cognitive enhancement, where it's not just communication. You are literally thinking in the cloud. You're not just moving information back and forth from it. Part of your actual thought process is there. And what I find uh, interesting and terrifying about that is, rather than saying, well, I'm going to communicate the concept of blue to you, you could, in theory, share digital neural space that you can't do in the biological space. So rather than
Hmm.
saying, I'm going to, here's my brain, here's my enhanced digital neural configuration, and then we're going to communicate, like, this together is me, and I'm going to communicate with you. It's that I'm going to have this digital neural space where thoughts are happening and we're communicating, with me. That's my pipeline for me. But then your digital neural space can overlap, and we can share that space and think about things together, so that there is no communication. You're sharing thoughts in a way that is, like, more fundamental and has never been done in biological history ever, right? Like, that's to me, like, super crazy. I'm super excited to see how that would change everything. Also, it means that, like, it would have to be some serious consideration to be like, how do you arrive at that, where if you lose access to that, you don't feel like you've been lobotomized, right?
Well,
Um,
it seems like that also goes beyond cyborg, because I would tend to look at Neuralink and the capabilities that that introduces, right? And you mentioned a couple other companies that are working on that as well. There's actually a ton of research. A lot of it is, as you've said, it's restorative. People with disabilities are participating in it and helping to generate these things. So I would tend to look at that as the cyborg, where it's the person and the machine and they're working together. What you're talking about kind of goes beyond that towards mind uploading, right? Which is
A little bit.
popular.
Mind uploading is not exactly that. Mind uploading is more like you take the biological brain and you duplicate it
Okay.
in digital space. But what I'm talking about is mind, not brain. Like brain, the brain is realigning itself, but the brain is contained in your skull. Your mind will eh, think of the brain as like the hardware your computer runs on, and your mind is the operating system, right?
Okay.
So it's like the brain, aka the laptop, right? Hardware. Now you've plugged in a USB thing, and now you've networked it with other stuff. The hardware is now growing in a way that is not, you know, not what your mind is used to, but your mind will expand and run on hardware that is biological in your skull, but also in the cloud through Neuralink. Neuralink and these other companies will provide the gateway, the pipeline for connecting in your biological brain with a digital neural space. That's the function of that. It's not going to be a Neuralink feature. Neuralink, in my mind anyway, is just a means to move data, right? Just like the cable that comes to your house for internet, right? It isn't the
Yeah.
internet, it is the cable that runs the internet over it, right? And that's what Neuralink will be, is a cable between these digital services and your squishy bits in your skull. But that having a good cable with a lot of bandwidth will enable these kinds of things. And because the brain is constantly restructuring itself to be more efficient and utilize things, it's why when you have brain damage and you lose some ability, you can relearn it. It's because other parts of the brain are now configuring themselves to do that thing, and it's a great thing. Plasticity is awesome, but I think a natural consequence of that is going to be if you open this up in such a way that you are having two-way communication through neurons, you will be able to then create a digital neural space that thoughts will naturally start to migrate, like a brain, just like when it's taking over a dead function, it's reconfiguring itself. It will reconfigure itself to use that space if that's what's being provided at the other end of that pipe, right? And
Okay.
so that's the interesting thing. There's, of course, massive concerns about privacy, security, whatever. That's a whole other discussion. But imagine a future where you're able to buy a digital neural enhancement that you keep at your own house, right? And it's your private property and it's not Googleized or whatever. And your Neuralink is talking to that, right? Like that kind of helps feel a little less crazy, or it's a wearable that you wear that has all this capability, or maybe it's a digital implant elsewhere in your body that Neuralink is talking to that you can now carry around in your meat suit, right? That you don't have to have some external link to, but it is digitally enhancing your cognition. So, given the form, whatever the form factor that it takes is kind of irrelevant. The important part is that your mind is now able to expand beyond the confines of this 3 pound blob, right? That's what Neuralink, that's the future that these technologies can enable. Whether or not
Well,
it should, that's the whole another call.
absolutely. And again, it's remarkable. I mean, we started out with wearables. And so something that, starts out far outside the body comes onto the body and then inside of the body and ultimately changes the body and changes the mind. So these are tremendous ideas. Emil, let me thank you so much for your time. It was truly a pleasure. And to use a pun, I'm going to say this was absolutely mind blowing. So
Yeah,
I'll put
awesome.
that there, but let me close by asking, what are you currently working on? I know that things like Neuralink are a ways out there, right? You can't just walk into the store and buy that. What should we be looking for kind of in the more near term?
Well, right now we're really working on. I'm focused on VivoKey and our Apex platform, which is a smart card computer platform that's an implant. It can also be in a wearable. We have a ring that's in process now, but But the Apex as a implantable transponder is unique because it can run actual software programs that you can upload to it, and that can do all kinds of things. It can act as your Tesla key card. It can do PGP encryption, data encryption, decryption. It can be a FIDO security key. It can do payments if, you know, MasterCard or Visa, if anybody knows, let's have a conversation there. It can do a lot of things. And so that idea that I want to move all this kind of digital security, digital identity, those aspects, and even access control, like physical access to doors, computers, things like that. Move that all inside of me and not have it stored on my phone or in the cloud, you know, who knows where. So again, something that's under my control. I own my digital identity tokens. I manage them, and yeah, I never lose them.
Wonderful. Emil, thank you again so much for your time
Sure.
today, sir.
All right.